Hello everyone, in today's video I will be narrating stories that I found off of Reddit. If you enjoyed this video, make sure you subscribe to my channel, like this video, and comment something down below. But without further ado,
let's get straight into these stories.
I grew up in a small town where nothing much happened. It was the kind of place where people left their doors unlocked and everyone knew everyone. There was one major road that ran through town, a single set of traffic lights, and an old railway crossing that hadn't been active in years. The crossing was barely noticeable, just rusty tracks embedded in the asphalt with an old wooden arm that was permanently stuck halfway down. No trains had run through since before I was born, but the town never bothered to remove it. It was just a forgotten relic, one that most people didn't even think about, except for him. I first noticed the man when I was in high school. He would stand near the railway crossing at odd hours of the day and night, staring down the tracks. He wasn't a homeless man, his clothes were always clean, and he carried himself with an unsettling stillness. He never asked for money, never spoke to anyone. He just stood there, watching the tracks. At first, I assumed he was just some old guy reminiscing. Maybe he had worked on the railroad back when it was running, but something about him always felt rugged. The way he never moved, the way his head tilted slightly, as if he were listening to something only he could hear. One night, I was coming back from a friend's house when I had to pass by the crossing. The street was empty, and the street lights barely lit the cracked pavement. As I approached, I saw him standing there again, his back to me, facing the tracks. I don't know why, but my stomach dropped. Maybe it was because I had never seen him move before, but this time, as I walked past, he turned his head, not all the way, just enough for me to see the side of his face. His mouth moved, but no sound came out. I hurried past, pretending I hadn't noticed. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe he was just muttering to himself, but I started paying more attention after that, and the more I watched, the more I realized something terrifying. The man was always there, no matter the time, morning, noon, or midnight. Whenever I passed that crossing, he was standing there, and he never left. One night, after a late shift at work, I decided to test something. I parked my car near the crossing and waited. An hour passed, then two. He didn't move. It was past midnight when my eyelids grew heavy. Just as I was about to give up and go home, I glanced at the crossing. He was gone. I sat up straight, my heart hammering. I hadn't looked away for more than a few seconds, but the man had vanished. The track stretched empty under the dim glow of the streetlights. Then I heard it, a long, distant whistle, low and echoing, like the sound of a train. But that was impossible. The tracks were abandoned. I didn't wait to find out more. I started my car and sped home, refusing to look in the rearview mirror. The next day, I told my dad about it. He frowned and rubbed his chin. The man at the crossing. He said slowly. I nodded. He exhaled sharply. Son, that crossing hasn't been used in 50 years. I know, I said, but no, listen. His face had gone pale. Back in the 70 seconds, there was an accident. A man was standing on the tracks when a train came through. He didn't move, just stood there, watching. My skin went cold. They say the conductor saw him. My dad continued. He blew the horn, hit the brakes, but it was too late. The train passed right through him. When it stopped, there was nothing left. I swallowed hard, and after that, Dad hesitated. People say he never left. I moved away for college a year later. When I came back to visit, I made a point to avoid the crossing. I didn't want to see him again, but last summer, I drove through town late at night. My route took me past the old tracks, and out of morbid curiosity, I glanced over. The man was still there, standing at the crossing. I tried to shake the feeling of dread that followed me home that night. The man at the crossing was still there, still waiting. For what? I didn't know. I told myself I was done with it, that I would never drive that way again, but deep down, I knew that wasn't true. A few weeks later, curiosity got the better of me. I decided I needed to know more. Maybe it was stupid, but the way my dad had spoken about the accident, the way he'd gone pale when he realized what I was talking about, it felt like there was more to the story. I started asking around town. Most people brushed me off, others got quiet when I mentioned the man. One old woman at the diner even told me best to leave some things alone, dear. But then I found Sam. Sam was an old timer, the kind who had lived in town his whole life. When I brought up the man at the crossing, he didn't laugh or wave me off. He just nodded slowly and took a long sip of his coffee. You're not the first to see him, he said, and you won't be the last. I lay dead. What happened? My dad told me about an accident, but Sam set down his cup. His hands were shaking. It wasn't just an accident. I felt a chill creep up my spine. The man on the tracks. Sam hesitated. He wasn't just some poor soul who got caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. He wanted to be there. He stepped onto those tracks himself, stood there, staring down the train like he was waiting for it. I swallowed hard. The conductor saw him. Clear as day, Sam continued. said he locked eyes with him right before impact, but when the train passed through, he shook his head. No body, no blood, no nothing. A lump formed in my throat. They searched for days, dug up the tracks, checked every inch of the area, but he was just gone. I sat back in my seat, trying to process what I was hearing. So what? He just disappeared. Sam sighed. Depends on who you ask. I frowned. What do you mean? He glanced around as if making sure no one else was listening. Then he leaned in close. Some folks say he never left. The cold knot formed in my stomach. They say he's still there. Sam murmured, watching, waiting, listening for something only he could hear. My mouth went dry. Waiting for what? Sam met my eyes, his expression grim. For the next train. The next train. Those words echoed in my head long after I left the diner. I tried to push them away, to tell myself it was just an old ghost story, but deep down, I knew better. I decided then and there I was done. No more late night drives, no more looking for answers. I would never go near that crossing again, and for a while, I kept that promise, until last night. I was driving home late when I found myself on that familiar stretch of road. I hadn't meant to go that way, but my usual route was blocked due to construction, and this was the only other option. I told myself it was fine. I would just drive past, keep my eyes on the road, and not look. But as I neared the crossing, something felt off. The air was heavy, thick, like the world was holding its breath. The streetlights flickered, my radio crackled with static. Then I heard it, a low, distant whistle. My hands tightened on the wheel. No, that wasn't possible. There were no trains. I hit the gas, heart pounding. I just needed to get past the crossing, get home. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw him, standing at the edge of the tracks, just as still as ever. But this time, he was facing me, his head tilted, his lips moving silently, and then he stepped onto the tracks, right in front of my car. I slammed on the brakes, tires screeching. My heart hammered in my chest as my car came to a violent stop just inches from where he stood, except there was no one there. I sat there, gripping the steering wheel, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The road was empty, the man was gone. Then, from the radio, through the static, I heard something else. A voice, a whisper. Not yet. I didn't wait to hear more. I slammed my foot on the gas and sped all the way home, refusing to look in the rearview mirror. I don't know what he wants. I don't know what he's waiting for, but I do know this. I never want to meet him again. And if you ever find yourself driving down an old road at night, near an abandoned crossing, do yourself a favor. Don't stop. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw him. The way he turned to face me, the way his lips moved silently. And worst of all, the whisper on the radio. Not yet. I tried to tell myself it was my imagination, stress, lack of sleep, but I knew that wasn't true. I knew what I saw, and I had a horrible feeling that it wasn't over. The next morning, I checked my car. The brakes, the tires, everything was fine. No evidence that anything had been on the road in front of me. No footprints near the tracks. It was as if it had never happened, but I knew better. I decided I needed to leave town for a few days, clear my head, so I packed a bag and drove to stay with a friend a few towns over. I avoided the crossing, taking the long way around. Every time I passed railroad tracks, worky ones, I felt a shiver go down my spine. I stayed away for a week, told myself I was safe, that maybe I'd imagined the whole thing. Then, on the last night of my trip, my friend and I were watching TV when my phone rang. No caller ID. At first, I wasn't going to answer, but something about the way my stomach dropped made me press accept. I lifted the phone to my ear. For a moment, there was only static. Then, just barely audible over the noise, a voice. A whisper. Not yet. I hung up so fast my hand shook. My friend saw my face and asked what was wrong. I didn't have an answer, because how do you explain something like this? How do you tell someone that someone was following you? I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I made up an excuse and drove home. The whole way back, I had the overwhelming sense that I wasn't alone, that if I looked in the rearview mirror, I would see something I did not want to see. By the time I reached my town, the feeling had only gotten worse. I should have kept driving, should have just left, but I didn't. I went home, locked my doors, and tried to go about my life. For a while, everything seemed normal. No strange calls, no whispers, no sightings of the man at the crossing. Then, last night, I woke up at exactly 3:12 a.m. The room was silent, too silent, no crickets outside, no hum of the fridge from the kitchen, just silence, and then a long, distant whistle. I froze. No, it wasn't real. There were no trains. Then my phone lit up on my nightstand. No caller ID. I stared at it, heart hammering. It rang once, twice, 3 times. On the 4th fourth ring, it stopped. I let out a shaky breath. Then my phone buzzed with a message. It was just one word. Soon. I haven't left my house since. I don't know what's going to happen. I don't know what he's waiting for. But I know that I don't have much time. I don't know if this is a warning or a promise. But if you ever see a man standing near an abandoned crossing, staring at tracks that haven't seen a train in years, keep driving. Don't stop. Don't look. And if your phone rings in the middle of the night, don't answer. I was working as a night security guard at a small office building. It wasn't a big, fancy place, just a 4-story building with a few businesses renting space inside. During the day, it was busy with accountants, insurance agents, and a few tech startups. But at night, it was dead silent. My shift ran from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. I mostly just sat at the front desk, watched security monitors, and occasionally walked through the building to make sure everything was locked up. It was easy money, but there was always something eerie about being the only person in a place that was meant to be full of people. One night, around 2 a.m., the phone at the front desk rang. That was unusual. The internal phones in the building only worked for office-to-office calls. The front desk phone shouldn't have been able to receive outside calls at all. I picked it up. Hello. Silence. I listened for a few seconds, thinking maybe it was a bad connection. But there was nothing. No static, no breathing, no background noise. Just dead air. I hung up. A few minutes later, it rang again. I hesitated before answering. Front desk. Again, silence. This time, I didn't hang up right away. I waited, listening. After about 30 seconds, I heard something faint, barely audible. A whisper. I couldn't make out words, just the soft, rhythmic sound of someone speaking too quietly for me to understand. Then the line went dead. I was officially creeped out. I checked the security cameras, but everything looked normal. No movement in the halls, no doors open that shouldn't be. Just an empty office building in the middle of the night. I told myself it was a glitch. Maybe one of the office phones had a bad connection and was randomly dialing out. It wasn't a good explanation, but it was better than any alternative I could think of. An hour passed. Then, at exactly 3 a.m., the phone rang again. I stared at it, dread pulling in my stomach. I didn't want to answer, but I did. This time, as soon as I picked up, I heard breathing. Slow, deliberate, then a whisper, clear this time, right next to my ear. Come upstairs. I slammed the phone down so hard it echoed through the empty lobby. My pulse was racing. I checked the cameras again. Still nothing. But something felt wrong. I was suddenly aware of just how quiet the building was. Too quiet, the kind of silence that presses in on you, making you feel like you're not alone even when you are. I don't know what made me do it, but I stood up, grabbed my flashlight, and took the elevator to the second floor. The doors opened with a ding, and I stepped out into the dimly lit hallway. Nothing. I checked each floor, one by one. Every office was locked. Every hallway was empty. There was no sign that anyone had been there. Finally, I reached the 4th floor. The second I stepped out of the elevator, the phone at the front desk downstairs started ringing again. I froze. I was the only person in the building. The phone was ringing, and I wasn't there to answer it. The ringing stopped. Then, from somewhere down the darkened hallway, I heard a door click open. I didn't wait to see which one. I bolted back to the elevator, practically punching the button to go down. The doors took forever to close, and for a split second, I swore I saw a shadow move at the end of the hall. I spent the rest of my shift locked in the security office, watching the cameras. Nothing moved. No more calls came in at 6 a.m. When the first employees arrived, I practically ran to my car. I quit that job a week later. I never found out who or what was trying to get me to come upstairs that night. I tried to forget about that night, told myself it was just a weird coincidence, a mix of exhaustion and paranoia playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew better. Something had been there, and it wasn't done with me. A week after I quit, I got a new job at a hotel doing overnight front desk work. It wasn't much different. Long, quiet hours and occasional strange guests, but at least I wasn't alone. There were always at least a few other employees on shift. I told myself I was safe. Then, one night, around 3 a.m., the hotel phone rang. I picked it up without thinking. Come upstairs. My blood turned to ice. The voice was the same. A whisper, clear and deliberate. I slammed the phone down and looked around the lobby, suddenly feeling exposed. My coworker, Jason, was at the other desk, half asleep. He barely looked up. Wrong number, he muttered. I didn't answer. Just grabbed the receiver and checked the call log. There was nothing. No incoming call. No record of a number. I tried to tell myself it was a prank. Maybe some guest messing with me. But I couldn't shake the feeling that this was something else. The rest of my shift passed in agonizing silence. I kept glancing toward the elevators, half expecting to see someone or something standing there waiting. But nothing happened. Not that night. The next night, though, I got another call. I hesitated before answering, dread pulling in my stomach. Hello. Silence. Then, after a long pause, the whisper, "Why did you leave?" I slammed the phone down again. This time, Jason noticed. Dude, what's wrong? I swallowed hard. Nothing, I muttered. Just spam call. I don't know why I lied. Maybe because I didn't want to say it out loud, saying it would make it real. I checked the call log again. Nothing. That was the last night I worked at the hotel. I didn't even finish my 2 weeks notice. I told them I was sick and never came back. For months, I refused to work night shifts. I avoided anything that reminded me of that office building. I'd even changed my number, hoping that somehow it would keep the calls from finding me. For a while, it worked until last night. I was at home, in bed, when my phone buzzed. I reached for it groggily, assuming it was a wrong number, but when I looked at the screen, my stomach dropped. No caller ID. I stared at it, my heart pounding. It rang once, twice, 3 times. On the 4th ring, it stopped. A few seconds later, a voicemail notification popped up. My hand shook as I pressed play. At first, there was only static, then the whisper, "Come upstairs." I don't have an upstairs. I live in a single-story apartment. I didn't sleep last night. Every creak, every distant sound made my skin crawl. I kept checking my bedroom door, expecting to see it open on its own. I don't know what it wants. I don't know how it's still following me. I didn't sleep at all that night. I kept my phone turned face down, refusing to check if another call would come. Every tiny noise in my apartment felt like a warning. The creak of the pipes, the hum of the fridge, the occasional shifting of the building itself. Each sound made my pulse spike. I checked the door locks 5 times, made sure every window was shut, but I still didn't feel safe. That voicemail, "Come upstairs." I don't have an upstairs. So what the hell did it mean? 3:12 a.m. I must have dozed off at some point, because when I opened my eyes, my phone screen was glowing. 1 missed call, no caller ID. I stared at it, my breath coming in short gasps. Then, before I could even process what was happening, a notification, a voicemail. I didn't want to listen. Every instinct in me screamed no, but my hand moved on its own. I pressed play. Silence. Then the whisper, closer this time, more deliberate. "You left the door open." My stomach twisted into a knot. I shot up in bed, my eyes darting to the front door. I knew I had locked it. I had checked it over and over, but my bedroom door was open. I was sure I had closed it before going to bed. I never sleep with it open. A lump of cold fear settled in my chest. I grabbed the baseball bat I keep by my bed and crept toward the doorway, my breath shallow. My apartment was small. 1 bedroom, 1 bathroom, a living room with a tiny kitchen. From where I stood, I could see the front door. It was still locked, but the chain latch was undone. My skin crawled. Something wasn't here. I backed up, moving toward my phone to call someone, anyone, when I heard it. A soft creak from the closet, the one just outside my bedroom door. My legs locked up. I gripped the bat tighter, forcing myself to take 1 slow step forward. The closet door wasn't open, but something was off. The air in the apartment felt thick, heavy, like something was waiting. I raised my hand to the doorknob. Then, my phone buzzed. I jumped so hard I nearly dropped the bat. No caller ID. I turned to grab it, heart hammering. The second I picked it up, the closet door creaked open behind me. I spun around, swinging the bat instinctively. Nothing. The closet was empty. I stood there, panting, bat raised, feeling like I was losing my mind. Then I noticed my phone screen. The call had ended. Another voicemail. With shaking hands, I pressed play. At first, just static. Then, "Found you." The voice was right next to the speaker, like someone had whispered directly into my phone. I dropped it. I was done. I grabbed my keys, my wallet, and ran out the door, not stopping until I was in my car with the doors locked. I didn't go back. I crashed at a friend's place for the night, making up some excuse about a gas leak in my apartment. I didn't check my phone again until morning. There were no missed calls, no new voicemails. I travel a lot for work, which means I've stayed in more hotels than I can count. Most of them blurred together, beige walls, generic artwork, the faint smell of industrial cleaning supplies. Nothing special, but this one, I'll never forget it. It was a last-minute booking. My flight got delayed, and by the time I landed, it was past midnight. The usual chain hotels were fully booked, so my company put me up in a smaller, older hotel near the airport. It wasn't run down, but it definitely had a different vibe. The lobby was dimly lit. The receptionist barely looked up as she slid me my key, and the elevator creaked the entire way up to the 3rd floor. When I reached my room 319, something felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it at first. The door looked normal. The keycard worked fine, but the second I stepped inside, I felt like I was intruding, like I wasn't supposed to be there. The air was thick, almost damp. The room smelled slightly stale, like it hadn't been aired out in a while. The bed was neatly made. The lamps were on, but the longer I stood there, the stronger the feeling grew. Something wasn't right. I dropped my bag and went to close closed the curtains. That's when I noticed it. The closet door. It was open, just a crack. I never sleep with open doors. It's a weird thing I've had since childhood. So without thinking, I walked over and pushed it shut. The latch didn't catch. It swung back open about an inch. I frowned and tried again. Same thing. The third time, I made sure to press it firmly, waiting to hear the soft click of the latch. Satisfied, I turned away, and the door slowly creaked open behind me. I stared at it. My stomach twisted. Okay, old building. Maybe the floor was uneven, or there was a draft. I wasn't going to freak myself out over something silly. I left it alone and went to take a shower, trying to shake the weird feeling. The water was lukewarm at best, and the pressure was awful. Just my luck. But then, I heard it. A soft rustling, not from outside, from inside the room. I turned off the water, heart pounding. Silence. I stood there, dripping, listening so hard my ears rang. Then, just as I started to convince myself I was imagining things, a soft, deliberate tap on the bathroom door. Not a knock. A tap, like someone testing the surface with their fingernail. I didn't move, didn't breathe. I was alone. The door was locked. Right, slowly, as quietly as I could, I reached for the handle. My fingers trembled as I turned it, yanking the door open. Nothing. The room was empty. The closet door was wide open. My bag was on the floor, unzipped. That was it. I was done. I threw on my clothes, grabbed my stuff, and bolted out the door. I nearly ran into the receptionist as I reached the front desk, out of breath and shaken. I need a new room, I stammered. The receptionist, still barely looking up, just sighed. 319, and she asked. My stomach dropped. Yeah, she didn't ask why, didn't act surprised, just handed me a new key card without another word. I barely slept that night. The next morning, as I was checking out, I finally asked, "What's wrong with that room?" She paused, then, in the same flat tone, she said, "No one's supposed to be in 319. I blinked. What do you mean? You checked me in there." She shook her head. "It's been out of service for months." I stared at her, trying to process what she was saying, but it was clean. The bed was made. The lights were on. She just gave me a tired look. Housekeeping stopped going in there a long time ago. I left that hotel as fast as I could, but something about that last conversation stayed with me. No one's supposed to be in 319. Then who or what was in there with me? For months, I tried to brush it off. I told myself it was just an old building with quirks, that maybe the receptionist was just messing with me, or that there was some logical explanation I hadn't considered. But deep down, I knew better. And the worst part, I don't think it was done with me. 2 weeks after my stay at that hotel, I was back on the road for work. This time, a different city, a different hotel, a much nicer one, big, corporate, brightly lit, nothing creepy about it. I checked in, went up to my room, and settled in for the night. At around 2:30 a.m., I woke up to the sound of something rustling. I sat up, groggy, heart already pounding. The room was dark except for the faint glow from the streetlights outside. The rustling sound came again. I turned toward the source. The closet door was open, not just open, cracked, exactly the way it had been in room 319. Light breath caught in my throat. I was sure I had closed it before going to bed. I stared at the sliver of darkness inside, my mind racing. My first instinct was to turn on the light, but something stopped me, because deep inside that closet, just barely visible in the darkness, I saw movement, a slow, subtle shift, like someone was standing there, rocking ever so slightly, watching. I grabbed my phone, heart hammering, and flipped on the flashlight. Nothing. The closet was empty, but the air inside felt thick, stale, just like in that other room. I shut the door, locked it, and sat on the edge of my bed, wide awake until the sun came up. It was happening again. The next time was in my own apartment. I had just come home from another work trip, exhausted and half asleep. I tossed my bag onto the floor and collapsed onto my bed without even changing. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up freezing. My bedroom door was open. I was sure I had closed it, but that wasn't what made my blood run cold. It was my closet. The door, which I never leave open, was cracked, and from inside, I heard breathing. Slow, shallow, like someone trying not to be heard. I didn't move, didn't breathe. I just lay there, staring at that inch of darkness. Then, from deep inside, I heard it. A tap, soft, deliberate, like a fingernail against wood. I shot out of bed, turned on every light, and threw open the closet door. Nothing, just my clothes, my shoes, the usual. But the air inside felt wrong, thick, heavy, and for some reason, I had the overwhelming sense that I wasn't alone. I barely slept that night. The next morning, I did something I never thought I would do. I moved. For a while, things were quiet. No weird noises. No open doors. No feeling of being watched. I started to believe that maybe, just maybe, whatever had been following me was gone. Then, last night, it happened again. I was staying in yet another hotel, halfway across the country for work. This time, I double-checked everything. I made sure the closet was shut before I went to bed. At exactly 3:19 a.m., I woke up. The air was cold. The room was silent, and the closet door was cracked open, my heart pounded in my chest. Then, from the darkness inside, I heard it. A whisper, "Why did you leave?" I read, "I don't know what it is. I don't know how it keeps finding me. But I know one thing. I should have never opened that closet door in room 319. I don't know how to start this because I don't know how it ends. It's been 2 years since my stay in room 319. 2 years of running, avoiding certain hotels, certain rooms, certain closets. I thought movie would help. I thought staying in different places, never settling, would keep it from finding me. But I was wrong. And now, I think I'm out of time. And after my last encounter, I moved halfway across the country, changed jobs, and started sleeping with every light on. I avoided hotels whenever I could, and when I had no choice, I triple checked every door before going to sleep. For a while, nothing happened. Then, a few months ago, I started waking up at 3:19 a.m. every night. Not to any sound, not to anything obvious, just awake. Every time, my heart would be hammering like I had just been running. And every time, I felt watched. I started keeping my phone by my bed, checking the time immediately when I woke up. Always 3:19 a.m. Then, last month, I woke up, heart pounding, sweating, but I didn't check my phone right away, because this time, something was wrong. The air felt thick, like the pressure in the room had changed. My body was frozen, every hair on my skin standing up, and then, slowly, I became aware of a sound. It wasn't loud, it wasn't even close. It was a whisper, faint, garbled, coming from inside my closet. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't do anything but stare at the door. It was closed. I knew it was. I checked it before bed, but as I lay there, not moving, not even blinking, it creaked, the softest sound, barely audible, like something shifting behind it, and then a single, deliberate tap. My phone buzzed on my nightstand. I nearly jumped out of my skin. I grabbed it, fumbling to turn on the screen. No caller ID. My breath caught in my throat. Then, one new voicemail. I didn't want to listen. I didn't want to listen. But my thumb moved on its own, hitting play. At first, static. Then, he left the door open. I threw the phone. It hit the wall and shattered. But I didn't care, because at that exact moment, my closet door swung open, and something stepped out. I don't remember grabbing my keys. I don't remember opening my apartment door. But somehow, I was suddenly outside, barefoot, in the freezing night air. I drove to a friend's place, banged on the door until he let me in, wide-eyed and half asleep. I didn't explain anything. I couldn't. I just told him I couldn't go home. Not yet. I stayed on his couch for a week. When I finally went back to my apartment, I did not go inside alone. I brought another friend with me. The lights were still on and my broken phone was still on the floor. But the closet door, it was shut, and taped to it with a single piece of masking tape was a note, scrawled in messy, unfamiliar handwriting. 4 words, "You can't keep running." I moved again. I don't answer unknown calls. I don't stay in hotels. And I never ever sleep with the closet open. But it doesn't matter, because last night, in my new apartment, in a city I've never been to before, I woke up at 3:19 a.m. My phone was buzzing, no caller ID. And this time, I heard it before I even picked up. The whisper, not from my phone, not from outside, but from inside the closet, closer than ever. I had a layover at a small regional airport late at night. You know the kind, just a handful of gates, dim lighting, and no flights scheduled after 10 p.m. I was on my way home from a business trip, exhausted, and my next flight wasn't until morning. Rather than book a hotel, I figured I'd just stay in the terminal. I'd done it before in bigger airports, and while it wasn't comfortable, it was manageable. By 11:30 p.m., the place was practically deserted. The last flight had left, the shops were closed, and the only sounds were the occasional announcement over the speakers and the distant hum of cleaning machines. Even security had retreated somewhere. I assumed an office near baggage claim. I settled into one of those rigid, armrest-divided chairs, plugged in my phone, and tried to get comfortable. That's when I noticed him. A man sitting about 4 rows ahead of me, facing the windows that overlooked the dark tarmac. I hadn't seen him before, and I was sure I was alone just minutes ago. He was dressed in a gray suit, slightly wrinkled, with a thin black tie. His posture was rigid, hands resting on his knees. He didn't have luggage, no phone, nothing in front of him, just staring straight ahead. I assumed he was another stranded passenger, but something about him unsettled me. Maybe it was the stillness. People waiting for flights usually shift around, check their phones, sigh in frustration. But he didn't move. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself I was overthinking things. I put in my earbuds and pulled my hoodie over my head, trying to sleep. but sleep wouldn't come. At some point, curiosity got the better of me. I glanced over at him again. He was still there, still staring, but now his head was turned slightly, just enough that I could tell he was looking at me. A slow, creeping unease crawled up my spine. I looked away, pretending not to notice, but my heartbeat had picked up, and I was suddenly hyper-aware of how empty the terminal was. I checked the time, 2:07 a.m. That's when I heard it. A whisper. It was faint, almost like wind through a crack in the window, but unmistakable. It was coming from his direction. I pulled out one earbud. The whispering continued, soft and distinct, a murmuring sound, like someone speaking just below the threshold of comprehension. I was frozen. Every instinct screamed at me not to turn around, but I had to. When I did, he was standing, not facing me, still facing the dark windows, but closer than before. He hadn't made a sound when he stood up. No rustle of fabric, no footsteps, just standing. The whispering had stopped. I was officially done. I grabbed my backpack and moved, trying to act casual, heading toward the restroom, anything to put distance between us. I locked myself in a stall, breathing heavily, trying to collect myself. 5 minutes passed, then 10. I debated just staying there until morning. Eventually, I cracked the stall door open. The restroom was empty. Stepping cautiously back into the terminal, I looked around. He was gone. The chair where he had been sitting was empty. The whole terminal was empty. But here's the thing, there was only one way out. Past me. I never heard footsteps. Never saw him leave. I stayed awake the rest of the night, watching, waiting. No one else appeared until 5 a.m. when the first airport staff arrived. The relief I felt when the first employees arrived was overwhelming. I practically ran to the small airport cafe the moment it opened, just to be around people again. The barista gave me a tired but polite smile as she handed me my coffee. I wanted to ask her something, anything, about whether she'd ever seen something strange in the terminal at night, but I hesitated. What was I supposed to say? Hey, have you ever seen a man in a gray suit who appears and disappears without a sound? I sipped my coffee in silence, convincing myself that I was just overtired, that my brain had played tricks on me. By 6:30 a.m., the terminal had returned to life. Passengers shuffled in, dragging their suitcases, chatting groggily with travel companions. Flight announcements crackled over the intercom. The strange stillness of the night was gone, replaced by the normal, comforting chaos of an airport morning. I checked my boarding pass. My flight was on time, departing from gate 8. I grabbed my bag and started toward it, pushing the night's events to the back of my mind. And then I saw him again, if not sitting this time, standing near the far end of the terminal, just past security, too far for me to make out his expression, but I knew it was him. The same gray suit, the same stiff posture, his hands still resting at his sides, fingers slightly curled. He wasn't looking at me, not directly, but he was aware of me. I froze. My instincts screamed at me to keep walking, to board my plane and never look back, but something in me needed to confirm what I was seeing. I took a slow step forward, and he did too. Not toward me, not away, just a single, almost imperceptible shift in position, as if he were acknowledging my movement. The chill ran down my spine. The whispering from last night echoed in my memory, and suddenly I wanted to be anywhere but there. I forced myself to look away, kept walking, and got to my gate. Boarding began, and I all but ran onto the plane, gripping my ticket like a lifeline. I didn't let myself relax until the aircraft doors sealed shut and we lifted into the sky. Only then did I look out the window, half expecting to see him standing at the gate, watching. But there was nothing. I told myself that was the end of it, that I had escaped whatever I'd experienced in that terminal. And for a while, I believed it. It was 3 days later when the first one came. I was back home, still shaken but trying to put it behind me. My phone buzzed with an unknown number, no caller ID. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity won. I put the phone to my ear. Silence, and then a whisper, faint, indecipherable, just like in the terminal. I hung up immediately, my heart pounding. Tried to tell myself it was a prank, a wrong number, anything rational, but the calls kept coming. Not often, not every day, just enough to keep me on edge. Sometimes it was once a week, sometimes longer, always the same. Silence, then whispering, and no matter how many times I changed my number, they always found me. For the first few months, I did my best to ignore it. I stopped answering unknown numbers. I kept my phone on silent at night. I even changed my number twice, but it didn't matter. The calls continued, always the same. Silence, then the whispering. I tried to record it once, but my phone never picked up anything beyond the static of an empty line. It was like the sound only existed for me. The worst part, the calls were the least of it. It started small, a shadow moving in my periphery peripheral vision when I was home alone, the feeling of being watched, even when my curtains were drawn, doors that I swore I'd closed standing slightly ajar when I looked back. Then came the airport sightings. At first, I avoided traveling altogether, terrified that I'd see him again, but eventually, life forced me to fly for work. Each time I stepped into an airport, my chest tightened with dread, scanning every terminal, every waiting area. I never saw him directly, but I felt him. I would walk through a crowd and suddenly feel that same stillness from that night in the empty terminal. I would glance up at a reflection in a glass panel and swear I saw the shape of someone standing motionless, just out of focus. One time, during a layover, I caught my reflection in the bathroom mirror and froze, because in the background, in the dimly lit row of stalls behind me, there was a figure standing there, gray suit, black tie, but when I turned around, nothing. I stopped sleeping well, the calls, the shadows, the airport encounters. It was wearing me down. I couldn't tell if I was being haunted or hunted, but I knew one thing, it wasn't over. The final straw came 6 months after that first encounter. I had just gotten home from a work trip, exhausted and relieved to finally be away from airports for a while. I dumped my suitcase by the door, kicked off my shoes, and collapsed onto my couch. That's when my phone rang. No caller ID. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't answer. It rang again and again. Each time, I let it go to voicemail. Finally, the ringing stopped. I exhaled, rubbing my temples. I needed to sleep. Maybe if I just ignored it long enough, it would go away. But then my phone buzzed with a voicemail notification. I hesitated before pressing play. For the first few seconds, it was just silence. Then, not whispering, breathing, slow, deliberate, and then a single, distorted phrase spoken so softly it barely registered. Turn around. My entire body went cold. I sat there, gripping my phone so hard my fingers ached. My mind screamed, don't do it, but some awful, compulsive part of me had to know. I turned my head, and he was standing in the doorway to my living room, close enough that I could see the slight wrinkle in his suit, the way his hands twitched slightly at his sides. His face, I still can't describe it, not because I don't remember, but because my brain refuses to process what I saw. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, and then I blinked, and he was gone. I don't live in that apartment anymore. I packed up that night and never went back. I moved states, got a new job, a new number. I haven't been on a plane since. For a long time, I thought it was over, and then last week, I got an email from an unknown sender. No subject, no message, just an image attached, a photo of an empty airport terminal, and in the background, slightly blurred but unmistakable, a man in a gray suit. I stared at the email for a long time, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. There was no name, no sender information, just the image, the empty terminal, and him. I wanted to delete it, block the address, pretend I never saw it, but my curiosity, my fear won. I clicked to enlarge the image. The terminal was dimly lit, like it had been that night. The city was the same, the windows looking out onto the darkened tarmac. I scanned every inch of the image, my stomach in knots, dreading the moment my eyes landed on him. And then I saw him, not standing in the distance, not lurking in the shadows, but closer than before. The blurred effect in the background wasn't because of the camera, it was because he was in motion. Stepping forward, I shut my laptop so fast I nearly knocked it off the table. My pulse thundered in my ears. He was moving. That meant something. I didn't sleep that night. Every shadow in my apartment felt wrong. Every creak in the floorboards made my heart slam against my ribs. For the first time, I asked myself a question I had been too afraid to consider. What happens when he finally reaches me? The next morning, I woke to another email. No subject, no message, just another image, a screenshot of a boarding pass, my name, the flight number, and departure time, tonight, 11:47 p.m. No return ticket, no destination listed. I checked the airline's website. The flight number didn't exist. I was shaking now. My breath came in uneven gasps. I gripped my phone, staring at the screen, my mind screaming at me to ignore it, to turn off my device, to pretend none of this was happening. But then, a notification popped up. Your ride is arriving. A rideshare. I hadn't ordered one. I looked outside. A black car idled by the curb. I didn't move. The driver didn't either. The app showed no driver name, no details. Just, en route to airport. I don't know why I did it. Maybe I wanted answers. Maybe I was too tired to keep running. Maybe I just knew I didn't have a choice. I grabbed my bag, the one I always kept half packed out of habit, slipped on my jacket, took one last look at my apartment, knowing I'd never see it again. Then I stepped outside. The back door of the car opened before I even reached it. I hesitated, looked up at the rearview mirror. The driver wasn't visible, just a dark shape, slightly out of focus. Just like him, I slid into the sea. The door shut on its own. The car pulled away from the curb. The city blurred past, the lights smeared together, stretching like reflections on wet pavement. The street signs stopped making sense. I couldn't tell where we were going. The further we drove, the quieter everything became. Then, finally, the terminal. The car stopped, the door unlocked. I stepped out. The airport was empty. No staff, no travelers, no announcements over the speakers. Just silence, and him waited, standing just beyond the glass doors, inside the terminal, hands at his sides, posture rigid, watching. I walked toward it, and the door slid open. A boarding call crackled over unseen speakers. Final call for passenger. It spoke my name, and then nothing. I don't know where I am now, or maybe I do. The terminal is always empty. The windows look out onto a tarmac that never changes. No planes, no movement, just him. He doesn't whisper anymore. He just watches, and every night, a new flight number appears on the screen. A name is called, and someone else arrives. I used to think this was about me, that I was special, chosen, hunted, but now I understand. I wasn't the first, and I won't be the last. The terminal is always open. I was working at a maritime museum in a small coastal town, the kind that mostly catered to tourists during the summer. One of my tasks was closing up the exhibit hall in the evening, which included checking the interactive displays, turning off projectors, and locking the side doors that led out toward the docks. The museum had an old ferry on display, a real one decommissioned decades ago, sitting permanently moored behind the building. It wasn't open for tours, but sometimes we allowed special groups to walk through it with a guide. During the day, it wasn't that creepy. At night, though, I hated passing it on my way out. That evening, I was the last person left inside. I had just finished my rounds when I heard something, a crackling noise, followed by a distant voice. Last call for departure, final call, on board. I froze. The announcement was coming from the old ferry speaker system. The problem is that system hadn't worked in years. The wires had been cut when the ship was retired. I stepped outside to see if maybe, somehow, someone was inside the vessel. The only access was through a locked gate, and I knew it had been bolted shut before closing. But then I saw it, a dim light glowing through one of the ferry's portholes. It was faint, flickering, like an old oil lamp or a failing bulb. And then I heard the whistle, a long, drawn-out toot, like the ferry was preparing to leave the dock. At that point, I should have just left, but I couldn't move. I watched as shadows pass behind the porthole. Not just one, but several, like passengers boarding a ship. Then everything went silent. The light and the ferry flickered once and disappeared. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I told my boss about it, half expecting him to laugh it off. Instead, he got quiet. You're not the first to hear that, he finally said. They say the last crew never got off in time. The next few days at the museum were uneventful, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. Maybe it was my imagination, but the ferry felt different, heavier, like the air around it had thickened. Then, about a week later, something else happened. I was in the museum's back office, helping sort old documents, when one of my coworkers, Janet, an older woman who'd been there for years, walked in looking pale. Did you go near the ferry last night? She asked. No, I said. Why? She hesitated. I found footprints on the gangway this morning. I felt my stomach drop. The ferry's entrance had been locked up for years, and no one had the key except maintenance. Maybe it was security, I suggested. Janet shook her head. Security never goes near the ferry. They refuse. I laughed a little, but she didn't. Instead, she leaned in and lowered her voice. I heard it too. The whistle. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the shadows in the porthole, the way they had moved, not like tourists on a tour, but with purpose, like people who knew where they were going. The next evening, I stayed late again, but I refused to go outside alone. Instead, I watched from the museum's upper floor, where I had a clear view of the ferry through the window. At exactly 9:17 p.m., the lights flickered on inside the ship again. This time, I saw more figures standing on the deck. Their shapes were dark, indistinct, but there was no mistaking it. They were there, watching. Then, the whistle blew again, and the figures moved. Not chaotically, not confused, just like before they boarded. My breath caught as the ship tilted. It was impossible. The ferry was permanently moored. It shouldn't have moved, not even an inch. But I swear on everything I know, it listed to the side, just for a moment, like it was rocking on invisible waves. Then the lights inside went out, and everything was still. I left immediately. The next morning, I found Janet again. We need to talk, I said, and she nodded. Yeah, I think it's leaving soon. I stared at her. What does that mean? Janet took a long breath. Every few decades, the ferry tries again. It never quite makes it. But the shadows, they There are more of them now. I think it's getting full. I quit that same week. I don't know if the ferry ever left, but I check the local news sometimes, half expecting to see a headline that it's vanished, or worse, that they found something inside. After quitting the museum, I tried to put the whole thing behind me. I moved to a new job in a different town and stopped checking the news from my old coastal haunt. I even convinced myself that Janet had been messy with me, that all those late nights had made me imagine things. But 6 months later, I got a text from an old coworker. It was a link to a local news article. The headline read, "Decommissioned ferry sinks a mysterious incident, no signs of forced entry." My stomach turned cold. The article was vague, only stating that the ferry had somehow slipped free from its moorings during the night and drifted out into the bay before taking on water and sinking. The Coast Guard investigated but found no evidence of a break-in, no storm damage, no structural failures, nothing that could explain why a ship that had been stationary for decades had suddenly moved on its own. But the worst part, a witness, an early morning fisherman, reported seeing something impossible. He had been out on the water before dawn when he spotted the ferry in the distance. He claimed that for a few minutes, before it began sinking, the deck was lined with shadowy figures, still and silent, standing shoulder to shoulder, watching the shore. By the time rescue boats arrived, the ferry was already gone, swallowed by the sea. No bodies were found. I called Janet that evening, half expecting her not to answer, but she picked up on the second ring. "You saw the news," she said. "It wasn't a question." "What happened?" I asked. She exhaled. "It finally left." I didn't know what to say. She continued. "The museum director was there that morning. He said something that stuck with me." "What?" She hesitated. "He said the water where it sank was too deep." I frowned. "Too deep." "The old ferry route, it never went that far out. It was a short passage across the bay, but the ship didn't sink where it should have." I didn't understand. "Where did it sink?" Her voice dropped to a whisper. "Open water, deep ocean, far beyond where it was ever meant to go." A chill ran down my spine. I don't know where the ferry was trying to go that night, or what had been waiting for it in the darkness of the open sea. All I know is that it got there. This happened about a year ago, and I still think about it every time I walk into a crowd. It wasn't in some remote place or an abandoned building. It was in the middle of a festival, a packed, noisy, city-wide event full of food stalls, live music, and people laughing. You'd think that would be the last place you feel truly afraid. I was with my best friend, Jen, and we were weaving through the crowd, looking for something deep-fried to eat. We weren't drunk, just that kind of giddy you get when you're surrounded by happy people, warm lights, and the smell of funnel cake. We stopped at a stall selling homemade jewelry when I felt it. That's all. Felt that tight, uncomfortable pressure on the back of your neck when someone is watching you. I turned my head slightly, pretending to admire a row of rings, and that's when I saw him. He was standing in the middle of the street, just past the glow of the overhead lanterns, dressed in a completely ordinary way. Jeans, a dark hoodie, hands in his pockets. But what froze me was his face. He wasn't blinking, not in a casual, "Oh, I just happened to catch him mid-stare" way. His eyes were wide, too wide, like someone had pulled back his eyelids and forgotten to let go. He didn't move, didn't fidget, didn't even shift his weight like people normally do when they stand. He just stared, his pupils locked onto mine. I swallowed and turned back to Jin, trying to shake it off. Maybe he was just zoning out. Maybe I was overthinking. But when I glanced back, he was closer, not walking, not weaving through the people, just suddenly standing about 5 feet closer than before. And still, he didn't blink. My stomach flipped. I grabbed Jin's arm and muttered something about checking out the next stall. We moved, pushing deeper into the crowd, but the feeling didn't go away. I glanced back again. He was closer. We hadn't stopped. We hadn't slowed down. But he was just a few feet behind us now, face expressionless, body completely still, except for the fact that he kept getting closer. I panicked. I grabbed Jin's wrist and said, "Run." We darted between people, past booths, through a group of teenagers taking selfies, until we were breathless. We ducked into the nearest tent, which turned out to be selling handcrafted masks. Jin was confused, asking what was wrong, and I told her. The second I finished, she frowned. "That guy," she whispered, "the one at the hoodie." I nodded. Her face paled. "I saw him too," she said, "but like, before you did, when we were at the jewelry stall, he was standing behind you, just staring, and I swear, I never saw him move." We peeked out from the tent. He was standing right in the middle of the walkway, just outside the tent entrance. I swear to God, his eyes were still locked onto mine. That was it for me. I grabbed Jin and we bolted, shoving through the crowd until we found a security station. I didn't know what to say. What could I even report? A a man is looking at me weird, but when I turned back, expecting to see him there, standing just outside the security station, he was gone, vanished. We waited around for a while, nervously scanning the crowd, but he never showed up again. The festival ended, we went home, life moved on, but I swear, sometimes, when I'm in a crowd, just for a split second, I catch a glimpse of someone standing too still, staring too hard. For weeks after the festival, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. At first, it was just paranoia. I'd walk down a crowded sidewalk and suddenly feel the hairs on the back of my neck rise. I'd turn, expecting to see him, but there was always just a sea of normal people, tourists, commuters, families. Nothing out of place, nothing except the creeping sensation that somewhere in the crowd, someone was standing too still. Jen tried to reassure me, saying it was probably just a weird guy with no social awareness. Maybe he was high, she suggested, shrugging it off. Or trying to mess with people. It's creepy, but that's all. But then she called me at 2 a.m. She wasn't the type to freak out easily, so when I picked up and heard her voice shaking, I sat straight up in bed. He was outside my apartment. I felt my stomach drop. She said she'd gone out to throw the trash away, and when she turned back toward her building, she saw him, standing under the flickering streetlight, hands still in his pockets, eyes locked onto hers. Still, no, like in, she ran inside and locked the door. By the time she worked up the nerve to check through the peephole, he was gone. That was enough for me. I told her I was coming over, no arguments. I threw on a hoodie, grabbed my keys, and was out the door in minutes. It was a 15-minute drive to her place. I kept glancing at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see a dark figure sitting in my backseat. When I pulled up to her apartment building, she was already outside, pacing near the entrance. He's gone, she said before I could even ask. But she didn't look relieved. She looked worse. What happened? I demanded. She hesitated, then swallowed hard. I don't think he walked away, she whispered. I frowned. What do you mean? I never saw him leave. We stood there in silence, the street unnervingly quiet for the middle of the night. I looked around, scanning the alleyways, the parked cars, the windows above us. No sign of him. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching. That night, I stayed at Jen's place. Neither of us slept. Days passed, then weeks. Nothing happened. No sign of the man who never blinked. Maybe he'd gotten bored. Maybe it really was just some kind of sick joke. And then, one night, I woke up in my apartment to a soft tapping sound. Not at my door, at my window. I live on the 3rd floor. I sat up, my heart slamming in my chest. For a few seconds, I was too afraid to turn my head. The sound came again, tap, tap, tap. Finally, I forced myself to look. There, standing on the fire escape, was him. No emotion, no movement, no blinking, just staring at me through the glass. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't scream. My body locked up completely. Then, without making a single sound, he tilted his head, not like a person does when they're curious, or like something trying to imitate human movement and getting it just slightly wrong. And then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, he was gone. Not climbing down, not retreating, just gone. I barely slept after that. Moved out a month later. I don't know who or what he was. I don't know how he found me, or why he finally left. Moving didn't help. For a few months, things were quiet. I kept telling myself it was over, that maybe, somehow, whatever he was had lost interest. But deep down, I knew better. It was late November when it happened again. I was coming home from a friend's place, taking the bus back to my new apartment. It was raining, the kind of steady drizzle that makes everything feel muted. There weren't many people on the bus, just an old man staring out the window, a woman nodding off in her seat, and a teenager with headphones in. And him. At first, I didn't see him. I had my hood up, my head down, scrolling through my phone, but then the feeling crept over me, that familiar, icy awareness. I looked up. He was sitting across from me, that right across, a few rows back, but close enough that I could see his face, see those impossibly wide, unblinking eyes fixed on mine. I sucked in a sharp breath. My grip tightened on my phone. The bus rumbled on, hitting potholes, slowing at red lights. Nobody else seemed to notice anything. He didn't move, didn't shift, didn't twitch, didn't blink. I pressed my back against the seat, my mind racing. Should I get off early, stay on until I was near my building? But then what? Would he just follow me home again? A few minutes later, the bus jolted to a stop. I had maybe 5 seconds to decide, so I acted. As soon as the doors hissed open, I bolted. I pushed past the naughty woman, practically leaped onto the sidewalk, and took off running. The bus pulled away behind me. I risked a glance over my shoulder. He wasn't there. My chest was heaving, my heart hammering in my ears. I turned in a slow circle, scanning the street. Empty, just rows of closed shops, flickering streetlights, puddles reflecting the neon glow of a diner sign. Betty stayed on the bus. I waited for a few minutes, just to be sure. When nothing happened, I exhaled shakily and started walking home, keeping my head on a swivel. I barely made it a block before I saw him again, standing beneath a streetlight just ahead of me. I hadn't heard him approach, hadn't seen him move, but there he was. Same expressionless face, face, same unblinking stare, same impossible stillness. My stomach twisted into knots. I turned on my heel and ran the other way. I didn't care where, I just needed to get away. My footsteps echoed against the wet pavement as I sprinted down an alley, cutting through side streets, my breath ragged. I didn't stop until I reached my apartment building, fumbling with my keys, shoving the door open, slamming it behind me. I didn't look out the window, didn't check to see if he was outside. I just locked every door, every window, and sat in the middle of my living room, hands shaking. For the first time, I truly let myself wonder, what if he is a human? For days, I was on edge. I avoided buses. I avoided going out alone, but eventually, my fear dulled. Maybe I had lost him again. Then, one night, I was brushing my teeth when I caught something in the mirror. A shape, not behind me, beside me, like someone was standing just out of sight, inches away. I spun around. Nothing but my reflection. For a split second, just a fraction of a second, it wasn't copying me. It was standing completely still, and it wasn't blinking. I don't know what's happening. I don't know what he is. This happened a few months ago when I had a late night layover at a regional airport. It wasn't one of the major hubs, just a smaller airport that mostly handled domestic flights. My connecting flight had been delayed, and the terminal was almost empty by the time I got through security. Most of the shops and restaurants had already closed. A few passengers dozed in uncomfortable seats, their faces lit by the cold glow of their phones. A janitor mopped the floor near an abandoned coffee stand, and the only sign of life was the occasional announcement over the intercom. I found my gate and settled into a row of seats near the window, watching the tarmac. My flight was the last one of the night. The boarding area was deserted, except for one other passenger sitting a few rows away. She was an older woman, maybe in her late 60s, wearing a deep green coat with a brooch pinned to the collar. Her suitcase sat neatly at our feet. I didn't think much of her at first, just another traveler waiting to get home. But then I noticed something odd. She wasn't moving, not shifting in her seat, not scrolling through a phone, not adjusting her coat, just sitting there, hands folded in her lap, staring straight ahead. I tried not to let it bother me, but there was something unnerving about her complete stillness. The delay dragged on, and I leaned my head back, closing my eyes for a bit. When I opened them again, she was gone. I figured she must have gotten up to use the restroom, but something made me glance around the terminal. No sign of her, just the janitor, still mopping the same spot, and the board gate agent scrolling through his phone. Then came the boarding call. I grabbed my bag and made my way to the jet bridge. As I stepped onto the plane, I glanced down the aisle, and there she was, a woman in the green coat, sitting in a window seat near the back, hands still folded, still staring straight ahead. I felt a weird prickle of unease. I hadn't seen her board. She hadn't been ahead of me in line. The plane wasn't full, so I took my seat a few rows away, keeping her in my peripheral vision. The flight attendants went through their safety briefing, and the engines rumbled to life. As we took off, I looked over at her again. She was gone. The set was empty. No sign that anyone had been there at all. I don't know how to explain it. I knew what I saw. I'd even asked the flight attendant if someone had moved seats, but she just gave me a polite smile and said, "This row was empty when we took off." I didn't sleep a wink the rest of the flight. When we landed, I waited until most of the passengers had departed before getting up. As I stepped into the jet bridge, I glanced back one last time. The green coat was draped over the empty seat, and the brooch was missing. I stood frozen in the jet bridge, my brain scrambling for a logical explanation. Maybe she'd gone to the bathroom mid-flight and never came back. Maybe I had dozed off and missed her leaving, but none of it made sense. The flight attendant had said the row was empty, and yet her coat was still there. Passengers shuffled past me, eager to get off the plane and head to their destinations. I forced myself to move, stepping into the terminal. It was eerily quiet, even for this late hour. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, reflecting off the polished floors. I turned back toward the gate. The flight crew had already begun their final walkthrough. One of the attendants, a young guy with tired eyes, was coming out of the plane. I hesitated, then approached him. "Hey," I said, trying to keep my voice casual. "I think someone left their coat in the back row." He frowned. "Which row?" "Near the window, toward the rear." A woman was sitting there. He gave me a puzzled look. That section was empty. I felt my stomach tighten. No, I saw her. Older lady, green coat, brooch on the collar. She was there before we took off. I swear. The attendant glanced back into the plane, then gave a small, uneasy chuckle. "You're not the first person to say something like that." A cold chill ran through me. "What do you mean?" He sighed, rubbing his forehead. "Every now and then, passengers report seeing someone in the back of the plane on the last flight of the night. Usually an older woman, always in a green coat. But there's never anyone actually seated there." I stared at him. "That's not funny. I'm not joking." He exhaled sharply. "Look, I don't know if it's some weird trick of the light or just flight exhaustion messing with people's heads, but it happens more often than you think. I wanted to argue, to insist that she was real, that I had seen her waiting in the terminal, sitting right across from me, but my mouth felt dry, and my heart was beating too fast. I forced out one more question: what happens to the coat? The flight attendant shifted uncomfortably. Usually, it's just, "Oh, when we come back to clean the plane," vanishes overnight. No one's ever claimed it. That was all I needed to hear. Without another word, I turned and walked quickly toward baggage claim. I never looked back. Weeks later, curiosity got the better of me. I started searching online, digging through old forum posts and travel blogs, trying to find anything about the woman in the green coat. And then I found it. A news article buried in an old local paper's archives. Passenger found deceased at airport terminal. Flight home delayed indefinitely. The story was from decades ago. An elderly woman had been waiting for the last flight of the night, just like me. But before boarding, she had suffered a fatal heart attack in the terminal. Her personal effects had been collected: a green coat, a suitcase, a brooch pinned to her collar. She never made it on the plane, and yet, somehow, she is still trying. After finding the article, I couldn't shake the unease that had settled into my bones. The woman in the green coat wasn't just some shared hallucination or trick of the mind. She had been real, or at least, she had been once. I tried to put it behind me, but the feeling of being watched never left. It was subtle, an occasional flicker in my peripheral vision, a phantom sense of someone sitting nearby when I was alone. It got worse at night, especially when I traveled. A month later, I had to take another late night flight. Different airline, different airport, but as soon as I stepped into the terminal, a wave of dread hit me like a wall. I found my gate and sat down, scanning the waiting area. It was nearly empty, just a few scattered passengers slumped over their phones. I tried to convince myself that I was being paranoid, that I was letting an old story get to me. Then I saw her get, not right away, more like my brain filled in the details a second too late, like she had been there the whole time but I just hadn't registered it. Same green coat, same knit suitcase at her feet, but something was different this time. She was face MA. Before, she had always been motionless, staring blankly ahead, but now, her head was tilted just slightly in my direction. I couldn't see her eyes under the dim airport lighting, but I could feel them. I looked away, my pulse thudding in my ears. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. I turned back. She was closer, not by much, just a few rows forward, but I hadn't heard her move. I hadn't seen her stand. I grabbed my bag and stood up. I wasn't waiting for this flight. I wasn't waiting for any flight. I was leaving, going home, taking the first taxi out of there. I turned toward the main concourse and nearly slammed into a security guard. He gave me an odd look. "You okay?" I swallowed hard, nodding. I think I need to reschedule my flight." His gaze flicked over my shoulder, then back to me. Long begged. I risked a glance behind me. She was gone. The set was empty. No suitcase, no coat, nothing. The guard sighed, like he had seen this before. "Yeah," he muttered, almost to himself. "Happens sometimes." I didn't ask what he meant. I just left. I don't fly at night anymore. I don't take last flights, red eyes, or layovers in quiet terminals. But sometimes, late at night, when I'm half asleep, I hear the soft rustle of a coat shifting nearby, and I know she's still waiting. Alright, but that's it. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, make sure to subscribe to my channel, like this video, and comment something down below. But as always,
Have a nice day.